Hello, my History 289 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins talking to you about week 4 in the course. Hopefully at this point, you guys have the basics down about evidence, about historical facts and patterns and how to look for patterns, about at least a rudimentary understanding of what historiography is, and about some of the theories that look at some parts of history. Just want to reiterate something real quick about Marxist theory. You need to separate the how historians and maybe students of history have used Marxist theory ideas around capitalism and classism and power with regard to the socioeconomic from the development of the Communist Party or the Russian Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, or the Chinese Revolution, what have you. They're not mutually exclusive, but they are quite separate. And the reason why they're quite separate is one is just a theoretical analysis of different events in history using the ideas of Marx versus advocating for government overthrow, the end of capitalism, and the beginning of some other sort of economic system where people are on much more equal footing. Those are different. They're not one and the same. Um, there are historians who've used Marxist theory who aren't Marxist, including me. There are people who are historians who use Marxist theory and they are neo-Marxist, right? And there are folks who don't care for this stuff at all, who could have completely different approaches to history that don't involve Marx. So it's important to understand it because it's another methodology at getting at issues around class. That's all. And issues around the socioeconomic. It's not the only one. So this will not be the last time you'll be confronted with a methodology or a theory or an idea of how to approach history that you might not agree with. For instance, there's something called critical race theory, which is a new tool, a relatively new tool that historians are using to look at issues regarding slavery, race, racism in the Western world, in the world in general, in the United States, and in other places over history, right? So there are a lot of folks who have problems with critical race theory, even though it's been around for 30 years in other fields. So it's just our attempt to expose you to these theories and how they are applicable and where they might not be applicable. That is all. No one's trying to convert or proselytize here, unless you want to be proselytized to or converted. So anyway, just wanted to get that out the way. Today what we're going to talk about is more around historiography and around really sort of the way historians have conceived different aspects of history, whether it's U.S. history or European history or world history as the case may be. And you are being exposed to several different kinds of histories that really are all kind of connected by the term historiography. An approach to history that allows you to look at a particular piece of time and how a particular group of historians have covered that similar period or piece of time, right? And I'll start with Beard because Beard's kind of important. He's he's a very prominent U.S. historian from the early 20th century, and he's known as the father of what we in the field call consensus history. This idea that you need to have a grand or master narrative in order to talk about all of U.S. history, that you can kind of fit a lot of things within that master, grand, or consensus narrative, right? For those of us who don't believe in consensus history, and that's most of the profession these days, consensus history seems to take a great man approach to understanding U.S. history in the context of beer, which is later followed up by people like Samuel Morrison I've forgotten Commager's last name, along with Eliot and other people in the field from the early mid-20th century, all trying to write master grand narratives of U.S. history that involve basically rich men, rich white males, rich white Anglo-Saxon Protestant heterosexual males. And the further you extend that, the more and more you realize how many people are excluded from this master narrative. And so that's the historiography of U.S. history was dominated by people like Beard and Morrison and Commager and Eliot from the period roughly between 1920 until about the 1960s. And many textbooks, even textbooks that exist now, but certainly when I was in K-12, so that would have been a period between the mid 1970s and the mid to late 1980s. Just for those of you who are trying to date me, like date me in terms of how old I am. That's all. There are plenty of textbooks that basically still have that consensus history sort of theme to it, with blue boxes that said, "Oh, the Native Americans are doing this. Oh, and Black people were doing that. Oh, Latinos are doing this, and women were doing that." So you can still find plenty of textbooks that sort of have that grand scheme. And so Beard is really, what you're reading from Beard essentially is an encapsulation of that consensus or grand narrative style of talking about history in the U.S. context. And Beard doesn't really fully acknowledge the problems with this kind of history. That it leaves a lot out. It leaves a lot of nuance out. It basically concentrates on prominent people, right? And how does one decide who's a prominent person or not? How much money they have, whether they were a general in the U.S. Army or an admiral in the U.S. Navy. You determine that by you know, by assuming that their mark in history is greater than some obscure person. I mean, that's kind of where you get at the problems around consensus history anyway. So that's just giving you a bit more background on Beard, because just reading it by itself isn't going to tell you about the general historiography of U.S. history, conforming to the views of his views and the views of other people who wrote like him. So that's one. You also have a couple of, I think, one, maybe two readings that specifically deal with race and gender within the context of creating a master narrative, which, by the way, is also a form of consensus, but not to the extreme of Beard, not the extreme of Morrison and Commager and Eliot from the early part of the 20th century. And so Tilley and others are really trying to talk about the problems with consensus history, while also trying to create some sort of master narrative around race and gender, right? And that has its own set of problems, right? The fact is that Tilley deals with gender is primarily from a non-racial, meaning white women's perspective, since white folks tend to not see themselves as being of a race, so to speak, unless they're white supremacists, of course. Um, and race is being sort of race, broadly speaking, right? And how you incorporate that within the master narrative as well. Well, the problem is that some people occupy a space of both race and gender simultaneously, especially in the context of greater or lesser power relations and those kinds of things. In other words, women of color, for instance, occupy both. I mean, technically men of color do too. Gender is not just about women, it's about men as well, right? But in terms of talking about, if you're talking about from a Marxist or a womanist or a feminist perspective, excuse me, the whole issue of gender inequality, well, generally speaking, since most of our societies are patriarchal, the power tends to lie with men regardless of race. So the women are, and particularly women of color, are the ones who are experiencing relative powerlessness, relative marginalization, relative vulnerability in a patriarchal society. So you're getting at all those issues of what we call in the field intersectionality, the intersection between race and class and gender and those sorts of things. And the readings that you're doing on master narratives of race and class begin to get at that, but not quite. Because they're utilizing basically standard sort of anti-racist or anti-patriarchy kinds of notions around race and gender vis-a-vis in opposition to a consensus history that excludes people of color, that excludes women, et cetera, but not necessarily dealing with women of color specifically. Okay. And then finally, you have two sets of readings that specifically deal with the historiography around interdisciplinary approaches in the context of quantitative methods, which cliometrics is just one form of quantitative methods. Quantitative methods did not used to be part of the historical field. People up until the 1960s were so consumed with creating master narratives, grand narratives, consensus history that when the whole rise of social history began in the 1960s in the field, particularly in the US context, people had to devise different ways of doing that history. After all, if you're looking at millions and millions and millions of people and what those people did in terms of moving from farm to city, from one part of the country to another, and forming unions and going to war and achieving prosperity and going through depression, in terms of race riots or any number of other things, when you're looking at large groups of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, and sometimes tens of millions of people, you're not really looking at what they're doing individually, which is something we talked about during discussion in week 4, but what collectively they seem to be generally doing, right? And in order to do that sort of work, that means sometimes working with data sets. Like, for instance, if you want to figure out that 50 million Americans moved from city to suburb between 1945 and 1980, you need to look at census data to do that, buddy. If you want to understand how test scores on the NAEP have gone up by an average of about 10% over the years between 1969 and 2003, that means running a data set from the U.S. Department of Education in which you can compare test scores across time by gender, by class, by gender and by race over the course of 20 or 25, 30 or 35 years, right? So that's the kind of thing you're talking about with quantitative methods. Up until this point, everything has sort of been either just telling a story or using qualitative methodologies, right? Oral histories, diaries, uh, uh, calendars, if you will, people taking notes, right? Any newspaper accounts, etc., to really get at what happened at a particular moment of time and how and why it happened. Now you can use data, numbers, crunch numbers, use SPSS or SAS or any number of other of crunching number types of computer programs that are developed in the 70s, 60s, and 70s specifically for these purposes in order to get at and control for different things in terms of why is there so much class inequality in the U.S.? Why is there so much racial inequality in the U.S.? How many people moved from the rural South to the Midwest and northeastern United States between 1900 and 1930 kind of stuff, right? And so cliometrics is specifically the use of quantitative methods within a historical context. One of the more prominent uses of cliometrics in this particular case is actually in Europe, looking at basically diet, height, weight, and other variables for, say, the working classes in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And it's really where it becomes prominent. Cliometrics in specific context, being able to figure out that the average man was probably about 5'3", and circa 1800, that they weighed approximately 140 pounds, right? Average life expectancy of roughly 45 years, 40 to 45 years. Had a lot of people with disease, with brittle bone issues, with osteoporosis and scoliosis, curvature of the spine, and so on and so forth. Basically taking something that is extremely sciencey, right, like archaeology and physics and biology and genetics and those kinds of things, and quantifying it within a historical context. We need the historian is more than just a historian here. In this case, the historian is literally using full-fledged scientific methods for social scientific or humanities type of purpose. As someone who's actually used SPSS before, who's actually created charts and graphs and and those kinds of things and run variables. This is a long time ago for me. There's also the problem with bias even with this, because you can look at a particular data set and just get the interpretation wrong based on your own biases or just based on the fact that you don't have enough data to work with. Two of the more prominent members of the Cliometrics community from the 1970s are Stanley Fogelman and Robert Ingerman, who wrote a book in 1974 called Time on the Cross. It's based on data from a slave plantation in the South in the 1840s or 50s, if I remember correctly. And they looked at pretty much everything. They looked at diet, they looked at beatings, whippings, how long people were worked, etc., etc. And they basically made the argument that slavery in the U.S. context was not as bad as people thought it was. It was brutal, but it wasn't that brutal because slaves ate at average at 1,800 calories a day. The average slave was only received 21 lashes per year, which is basically 0.7% of a full beating. Excuse me, 0.7 of a full beating, 0.7 if you look at the variable, meaning that it wasn't as horrific, except for the fact that you have to count for things like slaves working upwards of 20 hours day and night in order to do things like reap cotton so that raw cotton can be exported and things like that during harvesting season. That there would be plenty of times of the year where they weren't just working from sun up to sundown, but they were working half the night too, right? That they'd work, these hours obviously for free. That they weren't exactly eating steak and and macaroni and cheese and cake for dinner to get to those 1,800 calories, right? And that even if they had 1,800 calories a day, 1,800 calories is likely not enough to work in the hot sun for months at a time, right? And the fact that 0.7 beatings per slave per year is an average, right? 21 lashes of the whip is still 21 lashes of the whip. Even if that average were perfect, every slave only got beat 21 times out of a possible 30, 29 lashes out of a possible 39 per slave. It still meant you got beat once a year. That's pretty brutal, no matter how you slice it. So there's always a question of using that toolbox and how explanatory the power of that toolbox is in terms of understanding history. Historians still use quantitative methods to be sure, but the absolute belief that quantitative methods can prove everything and anything gives us accuracy and explanatory power on a level that we haven't seen before has been proven to be false, right? Because you can still have bias, you can still misinterpret, you can still not be using the tool correctly in order to get to what you need to get to. And that one tool is usually not enough to get all the information you need. You need multiple tools being used at multiple levels to do so. So all this is part of the theme of historiography, even though consensus history, quantitative methods, and cliometrics, and master narratives around race and gender are distinctly different things, and they come up in distinctly different periods of time, covering most of the 20th century, as a matter of fact, between roughly 1920 and 1985-90, in terms of the high point of quantitative methods. Of course, there's this whole thing known as digital humanities, which is basically another take on using quantitative methods, but beyond quantitative methods, it's basically using computer-aided analysis to do textual analysis, to do qualitative methods and not just quantitative methods, and of course quantitative methods and crunching numbers as well. So we won't talk about that again probably till week 7 or week 8. Anyway, so that's this week.